We left off looking at the Minoans, Caphtorites, the folks who Arthur Evans thought named the Minoans when they discovered Crete. And they lived at about, can you folks see my little arrow going here? Good. So in a way, they were contemporaneous with the Mycenaeans, but we don't know much about the Mycenaeans prior to their beginning expansion into the Aegean, okay? We generally think they were inhabitants of Mycenae, about 3000 to 2000 BCE, and we know that they conquered and, set fire to and, destroyed Crete somewhere around 1500 BC. But other than that, the first Mycenaeans, the first evidence of them having any building structures were about 2100 BCE in Mycenae. And I'm going to, we'll try this. This is blurry. I hope you can see it okay. This is Mycenae, and you can see it is is a portion of Greece, right? What we would call Greece today. Here's Knossos down here that we were talking about when we talked about Crete. And we do know that they lived there in Mycenae because there is one citadel still standing. And these folks are the folks that Homer, and I'll get a little bit about him, but anyway, Homer wrote about in the Iliad and the Odyssey. These were the warriors from Greece, and they built these great big, you can see these are huge, right? And these were referred to in Greek literature as the Cyclopean walls. If you remember, the Cyclops was this one-eyed giant. So when they got written about or talked about by Homer some 800 years later or so, they saw the classical Greeks thought of them as a race of giants because they had no idea how they could, accomplish this kind of architecture. What they were, we know from the stories about them, is a warrior culture, a warrior race. And the people of the Iliad and the Odyssey were the warriors who attacked Troy, right? And the fall of Troy, we know, is about 1200 BC. So we're talking about, folks who'd lived around in that Greek area for a couple thousand years, but then they went on the warpath. And by that time, they had developed a few big city-states, and a few with these huge megalithic building structures. So it's kind of interesting, I'm at 61, that the people of the Iliad and the Odyssey were thought to be legends and fiction for a very long time. Until, so if we note that timeline, let me back up a little bit, that Homer is the supposed blind poet, okay, and he wrote, or he did not write, he was not a writer, he was illiterate, as most people were in those days, so he was probably more like a singing bard, or maybe some folks think he may have been a group of folks, who were actually, it's kind of like the argument about Shakespeare, did he write it all himself, or was there kind of a school of, and nothing of Homer's work was written. He lived about 800 BC, and nothing in his work was written down until the classical age. So there's 400 years, a mere 400 years in between the time that Homer supposedly told this story, and then another 400 years back from Homer is when it happened. So you can see why people would come to think of the whole story as being a legend or a piece of fiction, right? Art, stories of people. But what we've discovered through archaeology and what we keep discovering is that every group who has the story of the ancient time before them, when we examine them, we discover that they have stories about an even more ancient time before them. So history, verbal and oral history runs back a very long time. And it is discovered to be fact, was discovered to be fact by a 19th century amateur, oops, wrong direction, sorry guys. Heinrich Schliemann. Schliemann was a rich industrialist who made lots and lots of money and always had a fascination for ancient society and for the story of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And so when he had plenty of money and he decided it was time to go do what he wanted to do in his life, which was find Troy, he set out and he used the Iliad as his guide, as his map. And eventually he actually succeeded in finding, finding a civilization, 7 layers deep. He was an amateur, archaeologist. This is so often. Have you noticed how often the big discoveries come from the amateurs? And then of course the intellectuals get in there and they smooth it out and, fight over it and dig it up. But anyway, that's what happened with Schliemann. And we'll find that some of his, what he thought he saw and what other people would think they see have since been debunked. But the basic story essentially was substantiated as being some kind of a history, right? So Homer's Iliad and Odyssey seem to have been a pretty effective history because Schliemann was able to use the information in the Iliad to actually find a civilization under a bunch of hills, which just looked like another hill, in the Troy area, and to discover and prove that somebody there did exist. Now, he didn't know, by the time he got finished digging up without much skills, etc., he couldn't figure out which of the 7 layers that he had were actually Troy. So that was a bit of a problem. But so if we move on a little bit here. So in the Iliad and the Odyssey, we come to know these people who probably most of you are familiar with, because the stories have come down to us so significantly. They've been, once set down in the age of Athens, once they were set down, they have been used as a major source of education for all of Western civilization. So the details of the Iliad here are folks that you may or may not know. I'm just going to briefly kind of introduce them to you. Here's Menelaus, okay? This was the king of Mycenae, okay? And Mycenae is the area where we will find in the classical era the city of Troy, of Sparta, or the city-state of Sparta, okay? He was also the husband, Menelaus was the husband of Helen of Troy. Then we have Paris. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. Didn't mean to do that. Back. Sorry. Paris was a Trojan prince who abducted or seduced, depending on who's telling the story, Helen, and took her back to his citadel, and thus started the Trojan War. Diomedes was a Trojan commander, and he was a seafarer, so he was a sailor, a major sailor at the sea, and he was at the siege of the Trojans during the Trojan War. Odysseus, most famous probably among them for you, is the Greek hero known for his cunning, his sneakiness, and his idea of building the Trojan horse after they had tried to lay siege to the great walled city of Troy without success for a very long time, and that they then decided they had to, try to sneak in somehow. And so they pretended to leave, and where'd my pointer go? Sorry. They pretended to leave and left this horse behind. And you're all familiar, I presume, with the basic story of Trojan Horse. He was the king of Ithaca, and he is, of course, the main hero of the Odyssey. Nestor here, got it, where's my, why can't, there we go. Nestor was the king of Gerona. He fought with the Greeks. A whole bunch of people went to war to, you might say, defend Menelaus's honor. And he was a big talker. And today we would probably call him a motivational speaker. And then we have Agamemnon. I'm going to jump up here. Agamemnon was the king of Mycenae. He is the one who sacrificed his daughter, Iphigenia, to get good winds to go to war. You can see what's important to these men, not the women. And he was eventually murdered by Clytemnestra and her lover. When he came back from the Trojan War, you know, conquering hero comes back, but he's been gone for over 10 years, and needless to say, things have happened while he was gone. And then finally, we have Achilles here. Why am I having so much trouble with my pointer? There. And Achilles is known as the great warrior, one of the great warriors. There were all kinds of great warriors, of course, in the story of the Iliad. And Achilles was the great Greek warrior, and he was unkillable. And in here we get the story of how the women interject themselves slightly. Achilles' mother, Thetis, dipped him in the river Styx, so the story goes, for his protection. But she had to hold on to him somehow, so he didn't just drown in the Styx. So she held him by the heel, and that was his one vulnerable spot. And ultimately, he is killed by being shot in the heel. And that's why we call it an Achilles heel. Okay. Okay. So now let's talk about the
May
women.
I ask a quick question?
Absolutely. Please.
I think you referred to both Menelaus and Agamemnon as being the king of Mycenae. Did I mishear you, or were they?
I think Menelaus, yes. No, you didn't mishear me. You didn't mishear me. Actually, what I misread it. Menelaus was the king of Mycenaean Sparta, okay, which was a portion, a city-state in Mycenae.
Ah, okay. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you. Please feel free to ask questions. You know, unmute yourself and ask something as we go along. Okay. So let's talk about the women. We know much less about them, but there are some, and probably one of the most famous women of history, depicted here on a great vase, is Helen. Helen was supposedly the most beautiful woman in the world. And therefore, she was beautiful. It's true. But there was much more, or maybe it was true. Somebody thought she was beautiful. Lots of people said that she was beautiful. What is also true that is usually not mentioned is, remember we talked about patriarchal and matrilineal when I was talking about Egypt, that sometimes there was a mixture of how power was passed. Well, in Sparta, it was a patriarchal society, but the king was married to the matrilineal heiress. So it was like being married to Hatshepsut or someone like that. So she also carried with her at least the right, the lineage, the ownership of Troy. And I would suggest to you that maybe that was more what was really made the various kings willing to go to war, to just save Menelaus from his abandoning wife. Okay. Then we have Penelope, yeah. So Penelope is the faithful, she's the ideal woman, okay? So you have the sexy temptress, Helen, and you have, does this sound familiar? And then we have the ideal perfect woman who is faithful and who loves her husband and takes care of their children and waits. Odysseus was like 20 years gone, and she's faithfully waiting for him, turning into an old woman. And this is the role of the women in the warrior society, right? To be faithful to the men and to produce heirs. And that's what she did. But she had, as soon as he was gone, or let's say some along the time, she also was an heiress, and consequently but she was married into a patrilocal marriage, okay? So she was an heiress who was sent, though, to live with Odysseus. So when the woman goes into the man's home, she has less power, and maybe being faithful is her only option. Maybe she really loved the guy. Anyway, with this patrilocal marriage, she had no real allies, unlike Clytemnestra, who is the evil woman. So we got woman as beautiful temptress, woman as faithful wife and, childbearer, supporter of the men. And then we also have Clytemnestra. And Clytemnestra was married to Agamemnon. And if you remember, he sacrificed his daughter, Iphigenia, so he could get good winds to go to war. She was left at home, and I guess maybe she just was an unfaithful bitch like they tried to portray her. Maybe she was a little ticked off because her husband had just killed her daughter. Who knows what? Anyway, she was not a very, very thrilled with the whole thing. And when he got back, she and her lover, she took a lover, they killed him. Okay, so it's a very dramatic bunch of stories about how, and the women did take active roles, as you can see, at least the significant class leader women. And then we have one Trojan woman, my favorite. I'm always identifying with this woman. It's not a good idea because she was a tragic person, but this is Cassandra. Men fighting over the women lengthened the war. Achilles was sulking in his tent over stolen servant girl. Men didn't do without women while they were off at war. And in Troy, thinking Helen was worth a war was what led the Greeks there, and maybe booty and other things, who knows what. And I'm sorry, I'm a little late. I'm still talking really about Clytemnestra and Penelope. Killing women killing, enslaving, and raping women was de rigueur for the day. And Odysseus, after 20 years gone, when he came back home to his faithful Penelope, killed all the female slaves who had been unfaithful to him. So he had a big ego. He thought that he should have faithful Penelope and faithful servants who should all, waste away while he was gone. And so he had them murdered. So it was a pretty bloody situation. Now, who Cassandra is Cassandra is a Trojan princess, and she is cursed by Apollo with the ability to foresee what's going on, but no one would believe her. And so she is the prophetess, right? The seeress, the priestess, if you will. And so she, of course, recognized, but you know how being a seeress is, you don't exactly know exactly what's going on. You just know this is going to be really bad. Oh dear, this is going to be bad. And when she saw that Odysseus and his troops had supposedly left, and they'd left him this big present, the Trojans, after all that war, were ecstatic. But what Cassandra realized is that's bad. She saw flames. She saw the destruction of Troy. Don't bring that horse in here. Don't do it. That's a terrible idea. And she went around and tried to convince them. And of course, being cursed by Apollo, nobody believed her. And as you know in the story, they hauled the horse in, and all the Greek soldiers hidden inside waited until they celebrated themselves drunk, and then climbed out, let the rest of the soldiers who'd slipped back in the nighttime into the gates, and Troy was sacked and destroyed. And then, of course, Cassandra was taken as a slave along with everybody else, because to them, she wasn't a seeress. She was just a Trojan princess. Booty for the war. Okay. And the whole thing began because of a fight between a bunch of goddesses about who is the fairest in the land. The story is that there were three goddesses quarreling over who was the fairest, the most powerful, the greatest. Those goddesses were Hera and Athena and Aphrodite. And so they started the whole thing by giving Paris a golden apple if he could find the most beautiful woman in the world. And that's what started the whole thing. Greek gods and goddesses were human beings writ large, with all of our foibles and our petty quarreling. Oh, shoot, that is not supposed to be there. Well, it's in the wrong spot. Sorry, I'm going to go on here. So, sorry, I just wanted to tell you about, let me back up. So, in this, that's part of the reason their mythology is so pleasant, not pleasant, but so enduring, because it's a story of us, you know, the story of humans. And their gods are powerful humans, they're what we all want to be, and they, of course, are foible-ridden humans. Hera is a strange guardian of marriage. Consider Zeus, a remnant of the sacred marriage turned on its head, okay? So what's happened is that instead of being the sacred marriage to the goddess and then killed, Zeus becomes the warrior god, right? The god of gods. And in the oracle, if we have in the oracle, the seeress, of which Cassandra is just one example, okay, there's seeresses all the time, they're sitting upon the throne, the covered throne of Apollo, because Apollo was the source. That's why he could curse Cassandra, right? He was the source of visions and knowing the future and fortune telling, etc. And Pythia, the snake, covered the throne that the seeress is. So if you go to some of the different temples, you know, in Greece and Mycenae, there are often, there are a few examples of the snake-covered goddess. So the snake is still a major symbol of the goddess. And, but now she belongs to Apollo. So in other words, they've taken over the snake. And they will take over all these symbols. That's the way they do it, okay? This is out of order, but I'm going to tell you, you can see once again, it's out of order because it belongs in two places. Anyway, this is one of the things that Schliemann found when they dug up Mycenae and when they dug up Troy, and they found a lot of gold, right, in the burial. So like the Egyptians and others of their time, the people tried to take it with them. And this is a so-called death mask, and immediately it was announced to be the death mask of Agamemnon, because it was found in Mycenae, and he was the king. But it's 500 years older than when Agamemnon would have been living in Greece. So it's gone a long time, right, that you've had kings and such, but it's misnamed. It's not Agamemnon, but it is a prominent, probably kingly person found in some of the shaft graves in Mycenae. Okay. The great walls of Mycenae that Schliemann also dug up were the source of all that gold. And then after the fall of Troy, there is a period called the Dark Age. And burials show that men outnumber women during that period 2-to-1. And so it's just plain not a good place to be in Greece if you're a woman. Either it's better, well, this raises a question. It might be better because the Archaic Age, the one I've been talking about, the Mycenaean Age, the Archaic Age, was an age of aristocrats, tyrants, and warriors. We know that. You know, there were always war between these city-states. There is some fine sculpture and some fine art during this period, which have been found primarily kind of in the external reaches around. If you remember the map of Mycenae, you know, you have the center part there that is what we would call Mycenae, and then it spreads out, right? It conquers Crete, it conquers the whole Aegean, and of course, they're going to go to war and try and conquer, you know, the Far East there. Among this period, we do have some important ones. This is Sappho. And Sappho and Alcaeus were lyric poets. And Sappho was from Lesbos. She was called the 10th Muse and considered better than Homer. But her books were burned by the Christians because why? Sappho, and one of the reasons we call lesbians, you know, lesbians is because they come from Sappho's Lesbos. I mean, they don't come from, but they represent Sappho's Lesbos. Her books and her poetry was erotic and goddessy and lots of interaction between men and women, but particularly between the women, like the priestesses, etc. And so therefore the Christians said it was, oh my God, look what they have written, and they burned it all up. We also have Carina of Boeotia. She taught Pindar and beat him 5 times in poetry competitions. He called her a sow. Another critic complained she won because she was beautiful. Well, you see, you can't win if you're a woman in a patriarchal society. If you're not beautiful, you're a sow and to be looked down upon. And if you're beautiful, well, then you're cheating. And then there was Medea, an athlete who won prizes for singing, foot racing, chariot driving. A couple centuries later, it's a death sentence for a woman to even watch the Olympics. So you can see the overcoming of the elements of matriarchy or egalitarianism during the period of time. It's one of the reasons that I say that maybe the classical age was one of the worst places you could possibly be as a woman. You know, we say, oh, the golden age of Athens. Well, yes, this was actually only 100 years, very short period. They didn't last that long, 500 to 405 BCE. And we look back on it with great longing. And part of that is because the Athenians did create a democracy, for one of the first democracies in Western civilization. They were known for their philosophy, their deep thinking in many cases about what it is to be human. But they were also highly patriarchal and patrilineal. So women didn't really have any position in Athens. It was golden for men. The the Athenians saw the Parthenon and its subsidiary temples rise on the Acropolis. Well, those of you who've seen pictures or been to Greece, you know what a thing they did. They were beautiful. They turned out by the thousands to see plays like the Agamemnon and Aeschylus, the Antigone of Sophocles, and the Medea of Euripides. Socrates wandered through the streets and colonnades talking of the eternal problems of justice and human goodness. Direct democracy was a way of life. So they didn't have, elect people to go and speak for them. They went and spoke for themselves, which of course was only possible because it was a city-state, and although it was big for its day, it was still very small. And most citizens didn't participate. Most citizens, the citizens of Greece, the male citizens of Greece, participated directly in the making of laws and the administration of justice. Whereas few people in history have ever caught what they were pursuing, it can be said for Athens that no other time has a greater proportion of a city's population come closer to achieving its ideals. In the concrete sense, the empire, the money-making, the class of slaves, even the subordination of women were all necessary, so they tell us, to provide the citizens with the wealth and time to create the ideal city. So those citizens of Athens that is being spoken about here were 1/4 of the actual inhabitants. Right? So it was the elite. To be a citizen in Athens, you had to be an elite citizen male born there. The rest were foreigners, slaves, and women. and that's still true. Pomeroy said, rarely has there been a wider discrepancy between the cultural rewards a society had to offer and the women's participation in that culture. In fact, Athenian women were secluded, much as we look at women in the Middle East today who have to stay home and who can't go out and do anything, and if they do, they have to cover themselves from head to toe in a chador. The oikos, which was the nuclear family, was the center of this civilization, and it was the unit of citizenship. In other words, you had to be a part of an oikos, a leader of an oikos, to be a citizen. So when you talk about citizen, you're not talking about the people who live there or people who are born there or anything like that. You're talking about the patriarchal and patrilineal male situation. They controlled women's sexuality. A citizen could be sold into slavery if they were caught in flagrant delicto. That is, a citizen woman could be. So women were citizens, non-citizens, if you know what I mean. Well, somewhat like in America for the first couple hundred years, right, where we were citizens of America, but we had no political power. An adulteress had to be divorced, and if she was, she lost her dowry. A woman's dowry was required to be kept for them, but they couldn't control it. So when a man married a woman, she was expected to come with a dowry, right, with money to support the household, etc. And it was his job to, not go frittering it away. He was supposed to be protected, but he had complete control. So you can imagine what actually happened. Some guys were really honorable and some weren't. A woman could control only 3 to 6 days worth of wages. So they were not allowed to have any money to speak of. So there was no way of kind of run away from home. An eros was called an epikleros. An epikleros had special privileges and special limitations. The epikleros was married by her next of kin, even if she was already married, okay? So when an epikleros inherited, in other words, her father died, then even if she was a married woman with children, she could be forced to divorce her husband and marry her next of kin. We're going to keep it all in the family here. Since young girls were considered lustful, they were married off at 14 to men usually around 30. So that's another way of major control over women. And then they were secluded in special quarters. So respectable Athenian women were basically locked up in their houses. They had a gynosaeum, and that was a place where only women could go and where she would stay, and unless her husband came home and wanted her. Unless they were too poor to own a slave, a woman couldn't even go to the market. She couldn't go out shopping with her girlfriends. She was supposed to send her slave. And if she didn't, then of course she lost caste and she was looked down on. The only public appearance for women in ancient Athens were funerals and religious festivals. During those things, of course, since at least half the gods and goddesses were half female, there were certain festivals that had celebrated the goddess, and women were allowed to go to that. The main life for every citizen, respectable woman was motherhood. But even here, the fathers owned their children. They had total control whether to keep them or expose them. So you didn't even have control over the children you were bearing. Girls seem to have been at risk in terms of even surviving because statistics show that there were more males than females, which we know genetically is not natural, but it may be that we don't really know because often they didn't bother to even count the females. They didn't count the female children, they didn't count them. So either there were a lot more men than women, or there were even numbers, but we didn't count the girls. Either way, it doesn't sound too good. Sex was segregated and male homosexuality was common. Lesbianism? Possible, but unlikely. Remember, Sappho was hundreds of years before, and most women were so confined within their own homes that unless they had an agreeable, possible other partner woman, there wouldn't have been anywhere to do that. Okay, now I'm going to go on here. Okay, so here we are just want to talk about the city-states, okay? So we have Athens and we have Sparta down here. And you can see there were several others, right? Epirus and Thessaly and Macedonia. But when we talk about classical Greece, we're almost always talking about the Athenians and the Spartans. These were most of them were still aristocracies. And I'll talk about Sparta. It wasn't really a democracy either, but it's not an aristocracy in the same way that we have been talking about before, okay? Demosthenes said of women, we have mistresses for our enjoyment, concubines to serve our person, and wives for the bearing of legitimate offspring. Divide and conquer. The only free women were hetaira. Hetaira is a courtesan. Some would call it a prostitute or a concubine. It was acceptable, and most of the hetaira were sometimes educated. Frequently, they were foreign-born. And here is an example of a very famous hetaira, and her name was Aspasia. People sometimes ask me about my, email address. How come you call yourself Aspasia? Well, this is why. This is the only woman in Athens I might have appreciated being. Now, as a hetaira and a person from Miletus, she could not become a citizen. And that was a bit of a problem for her very enamored lover, Pericles, who was the head of the army and, and a big man about town. And because he wanted his children to be citizens. And he also wanted to be married to Aspasia. So he fought very hard to get the rule overruled, because, of course, it affected him badly. And we have Aristophanes, 446 to 388 BC. He is the author of the Lysistrata. And in his play, Lysistrata, women stopped the Peloponnesian War, that was the one between Athens and Sparta, with a sex strike. Now you need to know, oh wow, women could do that? Well, that's a satire. It is not remotely possible that women, even if they wanted to, could have had the power to really get together and form a sex strike. If you were a woman of stature, then you had no allies, and everybody in your household who wasn't your ally was a potential for the love of your husband, that is his sexual love, but you at least had the status of being the citizen wife, which meant you were better off, so why would you join? And then, of course, the women who were able to withhold sex were also owned primarily. They were slaves and prostitutes. So a woman like Aspasia would have been very rare. More likely, their lot in life was tragedy. Like Euripides described in the Medea. The Medea was a princess from another area who made the mistake of falling in love with a Greek and who was captured. And so she helped him escape, and he was supposed to take care of her and her children. But instead, of course, as soon as he got home, he got himself a good Athenian wife and a good old Greek wife, and he basically threw her away. And that made her so angry, and she was stuck, of course, being in a patrilocal situation, right? She had no power anymore. She'd been disowned by her father for the gall of, going off with a foreigner, and consequently, she took the only revenge she could on him, and has become one of the great evil women of history. She killed her children. That is, she killed his children, because they don't belong to her at all. So I think Medea is truly tragic, but also kind of heroic in her horror. But it's like, what can you do when you have no power whatsoever? And here was the plea. Only Euripides sort of took her that way to some extent in his play. And she has said, of all things upon earth that bleed and grow, an herb most bruised is woman. We must pay our store of gold, hoarded for that day, to buy us some man's love. And lo, they bring a master for our flesh. Home never taught her to think how best to guide toward peace this thing which sleepeth at her side. And she, who laboring long shall find some way whereby her Lord may bear with her, nor fray his yoke too fiercely, blessed is the breath that woman draws, else let her pray for death. And that brings us to another of the great Athenian, or at least characters that is best known, Aristotle. And Aristotle, as a philosopher, was extremely hard on women. He believed that females were defective males. And he looked at the earth closely. He said, look closely at the earth to define heaven. And what he looked at was the most restrictive society in the ancient world when it came to women. He would be a favorite of our church fathers with some disastrous results. He will be. And nature-culture dichotomy is what Aristotle preached and taught. And guess who was nature and guess who was culture? Anybody want to take a guess?
Well, women were nature.
Women were nature, right? Women were nature. Defined as chaotic, destructive, dangerous, uncontrollable. Oh God, how we hate that. Yes. And they systematically would destroy the earth if you let them have at it. There were other philosophies, by the way. There were quite a few other philosophies besides Socrates and Aristotle. None of them very much came down to us, but I would like to introduce you to the Stoics. And the Stoics were, with regard to women, pretty much reinforced traditional ideas, but you had to bear with it. So the men had to bear with their lives and the women were supposed to bear with theirs. There were the Neo-Pythagoreans who advised women to bear all their husband's sins, regardless of their cause. And the Epicureans, who did challenge some of the prevailing views, advising all to seek maximum pleasure with balance as the key. I kind of like the Epicureans because they were into balance. In other words, they didn't say like a hedonist, just go for pleasure, devil care, take what they may. But the notion was that if you, for instance, if you enjoy drink and you drink too much, then you get a hangover. And therefore you've diminished your pleasure. So reasonable, the idea of moderation in all things was the Epicureans' philosophy. And then there were the Cynics. The Cynics have something to recommend them. And interestingly, because I never thought, we demonize cynicism as just, seeing everything as evil and wicked and, bad. But in fact, they counseled getting really educated so that you could determine what you were seeing. And Hipparchia here was actually a cynic. And she was proud of her education. She accompanied her husband wherever he went. She enjoyed the company of learned men and women and Diogenes, and suggested a community of wives where women's desires were important. A woman really ahead of her time, and somebody who, of course, has been received essentially what is the way when women out of their time speak out. I don't know about you, but I never heard of her until I went out looking for women in history. Okay. So women in Athens bore citizen women. They bore soldiers. They were the mothers of soldiers. But this becomes more important in Sparta than in Athens. I should say, they did it in all the societies, but in Sparta, they got some status for it. And why is that? Well, it's not like I'd be dying to go to Sparta here, but because Sparta was a military society, completely military, and it's different than any others on the peninsula in the way it did things. Yes, women were to bear citizens, they were to bear soldiers, and the only people who had any status in Sparta were the soldiers and the bearers of soldiers. So you're still dependent on bearing boys, right? Get that first boy. But they had more practical freedom in Sparta. it was not very free or very lavish. I mean, if you like your comfort, you'd much rather live in Athens than in Sparta. There's a reason we call, like dorms where you get a bed that's made out of a board and you live on it, Spartan, right? And not anything that didn't really make you into a good, tough soldier was not very much valued in Sparta. The slaves did all the work. And so citizen women didn't have to do much work because they were, of course, the bearers of soldiers. But slaves also were significantly the most numerous. And they had to maintain a Spartan military regimen in order to keep slaves in line. I mean, when the slaves outnumber you about 5 to 10 to 1, you got to be sure you got control over them. And that is the way it was in Sparta. They did all the work. And one more here.
Gail, can I ask a question here?
Of course.
So slaves come up frequently.
Yes.
Were these slaves basically foreigners? Were they Greeks? What was the population that made up?
That's a good question. That's a good question. It's one of those things. And they were primarily either people of low class who had done something wrong and had been, condemned to slavery, or they'd been born a slave, or they were captives of war. So what happened to Cassandra, right? She was hauled back to Mycenae and to Athens, and I don't remember where she actually ended up, but she was enslaved, and she became actually a high-level slave. So there's actually a class divination between different kinds of slaves. They are not racially different, unlike what we experienced in our slavery here. They were anybody who had been defeated and could be then made into a slave. So if your society, like in Troy, whole tons of Trojans ended up being slaves to the winning army. And within slaves, people who had come, let's say, from the higher classes in the conquered areas, who had skills, you might say, right, or whatever, often would be handed out to people who would not put them to, physical hand labor, but use them within the households. And there are stories of slaves in all those, Greek city-states who had considerable significance. Most of them, of course, are just enslaved. You're a slave. Did that answer your question?
Yeah. Yes. Thanks.
Okay, sure. Absolutely. So here's the ideal Spartan warrior, right? Here he is. He's obviously ripped, I think we would say it today, and he is very strong, and he's ready for hand-to-hand combat. And so boys were taken off in Sparta at the age of 7 to the barracks, and there they lived their lives. So they learned to be warriors like this. Now the girls, on the other hand, the girls have more practical freedom in Sparta than they do in Athens. They are not sequestered in the same way. And in fact, and another problem was that, when people are constantly fighting, then the men are getting killed, right? So you really need to keep having more babies, preferably more male babies. So women who produced a lot of heirs had a lot of status, and it didn't matter quite that much who the father was. So they had different ways of, women were supposed to exercise. They were expected to be physical specimens, right? So that they could produce good physical specimens. So they had exercises, they had races, they had a lot of physical training, like the young men. And as you can see from the picture on the left here, their clothing was less cumbersome. The Athenian women are in long gowns and lots of stuff wrapped around them. And if you've ever been to Athens, you know that it's a fairly warm place to live. Where the Spartan women wore this little short peplum and ran around a lot. Since legitimacy was not so important, that isn't always good. She might be lent out by her husband to a friend to bear a child if he either had enough children or didn't feel like it or whatever. So, it's not like they were completely in charge of their bodies. But the only individual graves in Sparta were men who died in battle or women who died in childbirth. So both of those got similar burials, right? So you could be, I guess you could say, if you're willing to risk your life, male or female, you had some status in Sparta, as long as you weren't a slave, of course. And then there's another fun thing. If you look at the woman on the right here, that's the statue. You can see she's dressed like a Spartan woman, a Spartan statue or copy of. And that's because it was rather important. Part of what they did was they had a free-for-all courtship. And the way that men and women got together with, remember the boys have been raised in the barracks, right, from age 7, the women have been raised at home, etc. How are you going to get them to fall in love? Well, that doesn't matter, but at least mate, that would be good. And so they would have a free-for-all, a certain time when all of the eligible males and the eligible females would be put into one place, and then they would be able to run, and the guy would marry whoever he could catch physically. So that meant that a fleet-footed woman could have a little say over who she wanted to be caught by. Or maybe not, but it'd be worth a try you want to be able to run as fast or as slow as you want if you're a woman in this courtship ritual. And so women trained for it just as well as men. All the rest of the time, it was sex segregated, right? And then they would have certain times, festivals and things where the guys could go home and hopefully make a baby and then come back to the barracks. So it's not like I would be dying to live in Sparta, but as a woman, you would have had more freedom and more say kind of over your daily life and what was going on if you were a citizen woman in Sparta and managed to bear children without dying. That was, so you had some say. So let's move on to religion here. And what we see in classical society, of course, is a great deal of loss of the great mother. Power is divided and conquered mythologically. So it's not that they got rid of the great mother. The great mother, Greeks, female and male gods are, approximately even. And when they, tell the stories of them, they're doing all kinds of things to maneuver and manipulate, and have a say over each other. Men then, as always, had, the upper hand physically and politically, but that didn't necessarily give them the upper hand in interrelationships with the women one-on-one. With the conquer and what happens actually is God, period, is divided and conquered in the ancient world. So one of the things reason we tend to call it mythology and things like that and not see it as deeply religious or spiritual is because everybody had a different house god. There were all this pantheon. And as we all know, having been forced, I'm sure, to read mythology, right, in our high school classes, it was pretty hard to distinguish the behaviors and the emotions of the gods from the people, except they were more powerful and they were immortal. That was pretty much it. Hesiod was the main source for describing all of this in his Theogony and the evolution of order as a visited male gods over the chaotic universe. So the visionary male, so he's one of the ones that gives us the new divide and conquer, power over model in the Theogony. Now, I think he's describing what's going on pretty much, but it's the story of the universe. So, God becomes man writ large. And in this case with Hesiod, more man writ large. And the reason for this is because the universe is chaotic and dominated by a murderous goddess, and you can't trust her or control her or deal with what you like. So therefore, of course, men are only doing us a favor here by stepping up to the plate and the male gods conquering the females. So they've got the ramifications, the reasons all set up for them in Hesiod. I'm going to say it's almost 11. How about we take about 2 or 3 minutes just to stretch? I don't know about you, but when I'm watching my thing here, I am crooking my neck. So, maybe you too. I can't seem to get it in the right direction. Anyway, take a little minute, and when we get back, we'll talk about the religion and symbol reversal and role reversals in the ancient world. Well, in the ancient Greeks. Okay? See you soon.
We'll go back to the gallery view so everybody can see.
You can talk to each other even, and me. Yay.
Yeah. Okay, good.
Put your picture up if you can, so we can see your wonderful faces. I see all kinds of names.
Okay.
Great. Nice to see you here. I'm going to get some water and I'll be back.
Okay.
You can unmute yourselves and talk.
Yes.
I have this book to recommend about Schliemann and Troy. It's called God's Grace and Scholars. It's written by a German fellow, Karam, but it's very interesting about Schliemann's obsession and how much money it spent. Anyway, I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I think that's a quite famous book in a way. It's very readable, interesting book. Yeah, he was from Germany, right?
He was from Germany, yeah, and he was an industrialist and then spent a long time in Turkey, of course. By the way, today how you match people with each other, dating or so, in our technology age, there is a how should I say, a new way to know what kind of partner is good for you, and it's called attachment theory. And attachment theory or attachment science. To whom are you attached to? So you can look that up on the website, and there are a number of articles about it.
Okay. So Gail, maybe this is a stretch, but the Trojan Wars and all that, I mean, part of that you said there was men fighting over this golden apple that was going to be the prize. And that golden apple led to all sorts of destruction, etc. Is there any link between the biblical Garden of Eden and the forbidden fruit? I mean, these are all old stories. Yes. They borrowed from each other.
I don't know if you could, I mean, I haven't seen anybody actually draw the link, but what seems fairly obvious to me is that the goddess, the fruit, right? The fruit of the goddess, the fruit of fecundity, the source of survival life has been, is women. And that comes through with these symbols, right? The woman, the snake, all these things were all over the Middle East, the Near East, and all over, of course, the Mediterranean. And they would have been picked up on by the people who we'll get to next week, or no, week after next, after Rome. So these people are, yes, they're all connected, right? In a lot of their stories, their similarities. If you become really expert in all the different little cultures, you can find these things everywhere. So the apple or pomegranate, it was actually, people think today that it was a pomegranate, really, not an apple, but and that being the reason, you can see why. The pomegranate is loaded with seeds, right? And so when you cut it open, it's a perfect fertility symbol. So the people recognize, both for having love and children and all the things that make life lovely and eating, you need fertility. And the fertile source is the mother, right? The very birth, and from nursing at the breast, and from everything that goes on. And so so remember last week we talked about they worshipped around trees, right? The snake was seen as the male symbol, and the chalice, the full, right? The full. So these symbols have a tendency to endure. And then when you have a different takeover, you might say, of a different group, what they do is they can't really get rid of them. They're so easy to, kind of sneak in, like the fish symbol, et cetera, that what you have to do is symbol reversal. So you take it from being wonderful and good and nourishing, and you make it poison, like Snow White, right? The poison apple. This is, I think, quite consistent throughout the stories as I've looked at them. And that is that when you're trying to get rid of the old goddess, and she's everywhere, you have to make her evil. You've got to make her dangerous. You've got to make her chaotic nature, right? So you can look at nature as this wonderful, benign thing that we all live within, or you can look at it as, oh my God, I can't control this and I stay alive. And of course we humans do both. So I think, yeah, obviously, and you'll find it elsewhere. You'll find it in Persia. You'll find it, in all over Israel, and then getting thrown out in the desert, Egypt. These are symbols of the mother, right? The mother goddess. And she sneaks on through, like Mary in Christianity, but much diminished as patriarchy continues its march. So, yeah. I mean, one of the reasons I like snakes, I have snake earrings too, I forgot to put them on today, but is because she really is, we're taught to fear snakes, right? And to see them as, oh my God. But in fact, they are a major mother's goddess symbol, meaning in the world of the goddess, right? We had the snake, and the snake sometimes represents the male. Oh, which I think I will get to. Oh, I didn't write it in, but I'll try to get to when we talk about Hellenistic society and the birth of Alexander the Great, supposedly. So I'll get to that today. Any other questions or anything else that you'd like to or add to?
I have a question, Gail.
Yeah, sure.
We were talking about the basically the women of the Trojan War. I'm curious about Cressida. Is she purely an invention of Chaucer and Shakespeare's, or does she have any source within Homer?
Cressida, not Cassandra, right?
No, Cressida is Troilus and Cressida.
Troilus and Cressida. And you know what? I don't know the answer to that. That's a great question. Yeah, but what I do
She's very poorly treated by both of them.
What a surprise. Cresida, is that how it's spelled?
Cressida.
Ssida.
She is Shakespeare wrote a play called Troilus and Cressida.
I remember that. Yeah, you're right.
Which is set in the Trojan War.
Right.
And
I'm sure she's probably a real person, because what we're finding with all the rest of them is they were. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It's
in the beginning, we thought
the
it was
Shakespeare play is based on a work by Geoffrey Chaucer.
Chaucer, right?
Yeah, and again called Troilus and Cressida with a different spelling.
Yeah, I'm going to look it up because that's interesting. And my guess is, yes, of course, she was just part of more of the pantheon that I've delved into, because one of the things about the significance of the Greeks is that the rest of our society has taken them as a model, has read them, more, or they've read Homer. Everybody practically has to at least look at some version of, Homer. Even in the grammar school, my grandkids were doing a little play, and sure enough, it was, a very simple version of the Trojan War. And and then for a long time, of course, we thought it was fiction or legend or whatever. And you can imagine, because until we have modern archaeology, there's no way to prove. And so those things were long, in the sands of time, most literally. But I bet they are. That'd be my guess.
Okay.
Yeah, but I'll have to look that one up. Anybody else?
Well, just to mention, Goethe wrote also a play called Iphigenia.
Yes, that's the sacrificed daughter, right? Yeah. almost all of Western civilization, when you get to the, the literature, harkens back to whoever wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey down, that was written down, in the 4th century, 5th century BC, during the time of the classical period. But Homer lived 400 years before that, and so it must have been, they had a wonderful program, Roots, I think, years and years ago, that showed how the Africans would commit their history to verbal memory, right, and pass it on word for word to the rest. And I think that must be about the only way it could have happened.
Sure.
That whoever Homer was, that came down to Homer, and then he was probably a bard, right? A person who went out and sang the tales of your stories. And we do have that in lots of cultures. But then eventually, so they became so well known that the Athenians could write them down finally the first time, 400 years later. I mean, isn't that, I don't know about you, but that just blows my mind that they could. And then in the 19th century, that Heinrich Schliemann could actually use them to find, well, at least 7 civilizations, one of which was Troy. So they were there.
Right.
It's wonderfully amazing. And I thought to myself, why did I study history instead of, but I love the stories. That's why his story and her story, whatever. Okay, well, I have a little more here. So let's go back, if I may. Okay.
Good.
So here we are with Hesiod, right?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to tell you a little more of the early stories. What we find, so Hesiod is an Athenian, classic writer of the Theogony. Okay, and in the Theogony, we can see their interpretation of the evolutionary order as male gods began to dominate over goddesses, who were then symbol reversed or reversed in, instead of being the great nourishing mother, right? And we look at Mother Nature and you can see the great nourishing mother, or you can see the damn hurricane that just knocked your house down. And so now we become the damn hurricane, knocks your house down. And it's sort of murderous. And the first of these was G, who was the reigning earth goddess. And her children were deifications of the features of the physical world. So in other words, the Great Mother gave birth to the physical world. But her grandchildren were monstrous. So just one generation out from the Great Mother, and all of a sudden the family, of course, is disintegrating. They were monsters. G, of course, needed a husband, and she had a husband who was also her son. And that's another one of those things that we see when we go back into the ancient world, that there's a lot of, we don't know if there's actually intermarriage or if there's just, if you start out with just a mother, then you've got to find a, Eve, you've got just an Eve, you've got to have an Adam somewhere if you're going to end up with procreation. Humans figured that out pretty early. Anyway, her husband who was also her son, was Uranus, and from which we get universe, the Uranus universe. And he hated the children. He hated her. He was jealous, and he didn't like. So again, you can kind of say, oh, that kind of sounds like a human family, some human families at least. And so he would hide them deep within her. So he would bury them back into her. I don't know about you, but when I was a mother and I had my second child, my little 3-year-old daughter kept asking if I could put him back. So there's a kind of sort of lust for, I don't really like being displaced here. Anyway, so since she was mad about that, she gets her son Cronus to castrate his father with a sickle. And then the story repeats in the next generation. Cronus castrates his father, he becomes the dominant male, but then he swallows his children by G's daughter Rhea. So you can see, if you look at that, when I look at that, I see wow, the goddess didn't go down without a fight, right? She didn't let go of all that significant fecundity power without, and how does a woman fight against a powerful husband? Well, there's lots of stories in Western Civ about the mother teaming up with the son, right? So when he's born, who does he love, the father or the son? He wants to be like the father, but he loves the mother. And so Rhea and Cronus swallowed Rhea's children. And so G and Rhea, mother and the daughter, team up and they help her son Zeus overthrow his father. So this is how the universe began for the Greeks, okay? And so Zeus stops the patricide and establishes order by denying the power of women. So neither the wife, his wife, nor his mother is going to have the power. And of course, one of the ways that he takes that power is he even usurps the female basic power, because he gives birth to Athena out of the crown of his head. So all by himself, I don't need you. Here is the next group of goddesses. And remember, this is in Athens, right? They're coming up with all these stories. And he gives birth to Dionysus out of his thigh. So Zeus takes over, I guess you could call him a hermaphrodite, right? He's going to take over both the producing of the children and the and doesn't need a woman at all. Now, this is rather difficult because you really do need the dualism is also part of the concept of the religion. And the women stand for nature, earth, emotions, and of course chaos, and the men for culture, reason, and order. And so there's more than just the old battle of the sexes going on, but this is a very early battle of the sexes, you can see. And power over nature and over women is firmly established as the goal of men. Right? So what you have to do is get control of all these uncontrollable forces, which is a very human lust, right? To not be at the mercy of, to not be vulnerable, to not be underneath, the mother or anybody else who is powerful. So, and it's also, if you think about it, a very human ego issue. I'm the greatest. And in a result of that, if you read then the myths, of course, as set down in the 4th century, 5th to 4th century BC, you can see a reversal, a role reversal, or a way of diminishing the power within the goddesses, okay, of the people. So you've got gods and goddesses, you've got a whole pantheon, that already diminishes the power of the one, right, the total one. But now we've got to diminish the power of the females. And so we end up with, what's happening here? Let me try this. Oh, that's right. Well, is it chaos or is it beautiful? Oh, and the answer is yes. Women equal chaos. So we got to control them. But chaos is, well, awe-inspiring and beautiful. And nature is what we are within. So you can imagine that they have a certain conflict going here for as we demote women. And so here is Zeus, of course, he is taking over, right? And this of course is a modern picture, but I just love it because it's beautiful. And it has a lot of the elements. The women, let's take a look at the women. How do we have the women in Greek and reversed? Okay, so here we have Hera. Hera is the incarnation of the mother goddess with the sacred marriage, right? She's married And she's angry and jealous, and she doesn't like being demoted. So she's known as the jealous wife of philandering husband, right? So of course, what do the men want? Well, I want my wife to myself, and then I'd like to have all the other women too, if I could manage that. And so she is in that situation, because that's the way Zeus is, right? I mean, he's got a wandering eye. And so she is angry at him, and she's therefore regarded as being kind of a virago, not a real nice, docile woman. Then we have Athena, and Athena was originally a Cretan goddess. She was the hearth mother of the home, and now she's been born out of Zeus's head, and so she becomes the goddess of intellect and war, wisdom and war. And usually, not always, but very often, you will see her depicted with a big war helmet on, a warring helmet. And then we have that naughty Pandora, who's just always nosing about and curious and wants to know. She wants the old knowledge. Well, one of the things you've got to get rid of if you want to dominate other people is their ability to access knowledge, right? If you have ignorance, you can't get rid of some are smart and some are not, right? And some people are more curious than others, but you can get rid of knowledge. So she's seen as a troublesome girl, and because she's always wanting to know what's in the box, what's in the gifts of civilization. What the goddesses had poured in was they'd put into the box all the gifts of civilization. Well, guess what? They came like gifts tend to, with positive and negative qualities, right? And so there's always two sides to every story. And so when she opened the box, she is the goddess of knowledge, right? She's taken from the goddess of knowledge and of learning and education, but then she's converted into a troublesome girl who looses on the world all of the evils of civilization: disease, greed, misery, death. The only hope that is positive is that we can learn, possibly, and defeat these. But you can't defeat disease, greed, misery, and death except within, right? Within the self. And so she's kind of blamed for us being stuck with these bad character defects. It's nice to have a scapegoat. One of the most powerful goddesses of the ancient world, who was then demeaned, is Demeter. And that's because she's the old fertility goddess, right? The goddess of agriculture. She's the one who provides that tree bound, loaded with apples or pomegranates and all the good that makes our lives so pleasant, and we love to eat dinner together. But in her story, she loses her daughter Persephone to the underworld. And so we have positive God and negative God, right? The god of the earth and Zeus, and then you have the god of the underworld, Hades. And Hades is miserable, of course, down there, because the underworld is full of unpleasant things and death and decay and all that. So he's lonely and miserable, and he decides, well, he's going to get himself a wife. And so Persephone is a beautiful maiden, right, goddess. And so how does he get her? Well, she's also curious. The doggone it, curiosity killed the cat and a lot of the women. And she ends up being tempted into taking a pomegranate seed. She shouldn't. And ends up down in Hades, and he rapes her, and he's very happy to have her. But she is the daughter of Demeter. And so women are not without power. In this case, goddesses are not without power. And who is Demeter? She's the goddess of agriculture and the goddess of fertility, right? And so here's Hades down in there enjoying his, raped bride. And above in the world, what would you do if you were the goddess of agriculture and you had your daughter had been stolen away and you were mad, would you just say, oh, well, that's too bad? No? Anybody have an idea? Put on your, what would you do? You're the goddess of fertility and fecundity and agriculture. What
And
happens above?
focus, all sorts of agricultural problems.
Oh, famine, right? Famine, the things don't grow, there's drought, there's, she just grieves and she's crying and she's not tending to business. And as a result of that, there's devastation in this case. And so the other gods, would like to have at least some humans to watch, and we're entertaining critters, they get together and they say, look, Hades, you can't do this. You're going to have to do something about this. And ultimately, they make a deal that half the time Persephone can live with her mother, and the other half the time she has to go back down and live in the underworld. And so you can see that the female in this case still has some power if she's willing to use it. It is death-dealing power. Okay? And so, well, yeah, you're right. That chaotic mother, if you get her mad enough, you're in trouble. And she was mad enough. And this story of the battle, if you will, between the gods and goddesses, Demeter in this case and Hades, is acted out each year in the only festival in ancient Athens in which women were the dominant people, and the only time when they could for sure be coming out of their homes and celebrating and parading, etc. It's called the Thesmophoria, and it was the biggest festival in ancient Athens. So you still got a little bit of power in the goddess. They still exist, but they've been pretty thoroughly divided and conquered. But we do have one thing to think about that's important, and that is that in the Greek religions, all of the religions, there was one deadly sin, and it was hubris. So what is hubris? Excessive pride. We see it quite a bit these days, parading around in our politics. Hubris. So hubris would do you in. So there was a cautionary thing, you could say, about this taking over of the great mother goddess. And that was that if you get too big for your britches, you're likely to have a real problem. And that problem is going to come in the form of the goddess as Mother Nature. Might be worth thinking about today. Okay. Okay, now we're going to talk about the spread of this culture and the spread of Hellenic culture. And in Ptolemaic Greece and Egypt, we had mixed cultures, which generally favored women over the Hellenic culture. Divorce was allowed for both sexes. The dowry was usually returned. Children belonged to men, but often lived with their mother and fathers. Fathers were supposed to support and take care of their children, and there was some pressure mounting for monogamy. So women were less secluded. And as we move out of, the 4th century, and the Greeks by this mean, usually when I say the Greeks, it's an old thing, it's probably not accurate, but I'm talking about Sparta and Athens, right? When I say the Greeks, the ancient Greeks. But there was Macedonia, right, in the north. This was a monarchy, okay? There were all kinds of Ephesus, right, over here. And all these people did look to some extent to Athens, right, and Sparta, but particularly Athens was kind of the New York City of the ancient world. It was the place where people did such important things. And so they admired them while they kept their own ways of life. And class of course, has a huge effect on women's opportunities, just like it does on men's. And women in many of these other societies had more freedom, less protection, kind of like the Spartan women, you know, they had more freedom. The exposure of infants was common. When you had too many children in those days, you couldn't get an abortion. You just took them out and didn't take care of them. You left them out. And there's lots of stories about that. So the exposure, especially of girls throughout this period, begins to increase. And then estimates of girls' births are 3.6 with 1.6 survivors, while boys are 4.6 with 3 surviving. So it was, even with war and all that, it was still a better place to be a guy than a gal. Life in the lower classes was grim, but upper class women, of course, just like now, benefited from being married to wealthy husbands, from having slaves and others to take care of. Their lives could be pretty comfortable. In the Hellenistic period, the goddess Isis from Egypt becomes a major deity. And so you can see there's, if you look at the picture here, there's beginning to be a, you know, you might say the Far Eastern Mediterranean societies are having effects on one another. Aphrodite and Dionysus were the only deities retained from classical times to be actually worshipped. And in the this society, the romantic love was eulogized. Now, if we go to, oh, not there. Wait a minute, where's my pictures? 93. Oh, I know I'm going the wrong direction. Oh, I thought I had pictures of Alexander the Great. Where'd they go? Oh, come on. I am missing a bunch of pictures. Okay, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Alexander the Great. You're going to have to trust me in this regard. So the Hellenistic society is spread. We did look at the spread, right? By Alexander the Great, 4th century BC, to the Roman conquest of Egypt, the 30 BC. So that's where Hellenistic culture comes. And a question is raised, which is better for women, democracy or hereditary autocracy? And I don't know, what do you think? You know, we always tend to think that it's better to be, you know, a woman in a democracy. But in Athens, they had no vote, they had to stay inside, etc. In the other societies, which were all basically autocracies, or at least they were monarchies, primarily monarchies, women had a little more freedom to participate, especially if they had the right class, right? In other words, if they were princesses and queens and folks who had some power. In Macedonia, which was a city-state, on the fringes, horsemen with cavalry would become the new warriors, right? Because they could really beat down the troops of the city-states. And there was also admiration, and some people appreciated the pen being mightier than the sword. But they were all patriarchal. How were they less restrictive? And how did they influence their cultures? Well, Alexander's mother is kind of a good example, okay? He was born in Macedonia, up here, and his mother, who was shrewd and ambitious and ruthless, informed his father that basically he wasn't Alexander's father, that he was born, Philip of Macedon, who was a fairly powerful king and, you know, soldier, wasn't his father because Alexander had been born of a god. And that's because she had slept with the god in the form of a snake. Okay? So Alexander, according to his mother, was born of God, of her and a snake. And of course that offended his father. So he went out and he hired a tutor for Alexander, and that was Aristotle. And we know, of course, that Aristotle was one of the great misogynists of the ancient world, and he didn't think much of women. And he taught Alexander things like how people get born, and what he said was that the male produces a complete human and just puts it into the female for gestating. In other words, the woman is the earth. Okay, yeah, she's the great goddess. She has to carry it. They hadn't yet figured out to, implant it into a male in those days. But she had nothing to do with it except like the earth, right? She's dead like the earth. All the life force, that's coming from the male. Okay, and therefore, being the warrior and being born entirely of a male, he gave Philip a real good reason for yanking the power back, and then he taught Alexander a lot about everything they knew about military conquest and what was manly. And Alexander was one of the greatest warriors of the ancient world, and so he went out and he conquered. Okay, so these areas here, the Hellenistic states, as you can see, these were all basically brought into the Greek culture via Alexander's conquests. He didn't last very long, though. He died fairly young, as warriors are often wont to do. And his vast conquests were then divided by his 3 generals. So it wasn't a very long empire under the Greek leaderships. But in the process, one of the things that he did was that he would form the conquest of the territories and get the people to go along with it by marrying his generals to local princesses, local, beautiful women. So his troops and such were married off, or required to, if you want to be in his good graces, to marry and provide children and bind, you might say, the people to this Hellenistic culture, which would have a significance on us for a very long time. The person who took Egypt was his general Ptolemy. Okay? And sometimes people wonder, when I'm traipsing along through here, how come when I do Egypt, I don't do Cleopatra? And because she's the most famous Egyptian woman of all time. She was the daughter of Ptolemy. And so she is actually a Greek. But she learned a lot, and she knew how to be both a Greek and use the matrilineal of Egypt and her own willingness to kill off her brothers and everybody, ruthlessness of Greek generals, etc., to her advantage in order to deal with, of course, the all-conquering Roman Empire, which we will get to. When we get to the Romans. Okay. So, class and art and the culture of the Greeks had a great impact on that whole world as a result of the conquests of Alexander the Great. And one of the things that we can really see, though, was a change that occurred. Hellenistic art is very different than classical art. So you've seen the classical art. They're very stoic. The idea of the Athenians was pure balance. That's one of the reasons the Parthenon is so beautiful and so beautifully balanced, and people are still trying to use those golden means and ways of building today to try and get these beautiful buildings. Also, their statuary is ideal, right? They always wanted ideal proportions, perfect male and female bodies. The Hellenistic art is full of drama and emotion, and they depicted the passions and the relationship, where the Hellenic art is serene, and perfect and undisturbed regardless, and then copied very much in the Renaissance, like the David, the great David statue that I'm sure you've all seen, is again perfectly proportioned, comes from the biblical story, but it has the same kind of proportions that you'll find in the Athenian art, and not the drama and the depiction of passions that we find in Hellenic art. Life as lived was more important to the Hellenistic period. And here's Cupid, taking a little nap on the stone. Life as suffered. This is again Hellenistic, the old woman carrying the market woman, the old market woman. The faces, the structures, the way that people are posed, incredibly different. There was some freedom for a small minority of the upper class women, but it was a man's world. And man was still stuck wrestling with the snake, the goddess. So I'll leave it to you. Who's going to win, man or snake? According to Pomeroy, women's resistance to their own emancipation, which was not much during this time, was based on fear, and fear was well grounded. Submission, not competition, had been for the millennia the woman's way to her meal ticket. The transition has to be tricky. To betray competitiveness before one can compete is very self-defeating, and in most of the ancient world would have cost you your life. And we'll take a look at some of the women who tried that, who tried to wield power, when we get to Rome next week. So there we have it. Let me go back to us. Any comments, questions, additions, things that you might have been stimulated to think about? Feel free to unmute yourself and talk. No?
Well, I have one then.
Okay, Barry.
So at this time, most society was agrarian, farming, and women had an important role on farms. So I don't quite understand in these Greek city-states, they clearly had to have a huge farming infrastructure. And were there a whole society of rural women in addition to these elite women who were in the big cities?
Well, of course, wherever you have men, you have women. But a good deal of that work was done by slaves. And the slave women and men both are pretty much, that old history is written by the victors. We know practically nothing about them. We know about kind of in the slavery in Sparta a little bit, and they did all the work. So the citizen women, if you remember, also of Athens, were still less than 25% of the whole population. So who are the population? They're foreigners. They're doing some of in the cities, some are like having the shops and doing the work. But the women are secluded. But of course, if you're a starving peasant family, you're all going to get out there and try to work. But Rome will have that same problem. It will become, in some ways, the death of Rome is the fact that everybody who was a Roman citizen scrambled their way as best they could into the, Roman class, the upper class, and that's also true in certainly in Athens. And or you could be like Aspasia, who marries, right, the top dog. But out in the agrarian world, Macedonia, Alexander the Great's world, is more like what you're describing. It's more rural. It was a horse culture, and you can see why, because you had to get around. Macedonia was far greater in size than Athens, but it didn't have the how are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Athens? After they've gone to Athens, the city states were where the action was.
Mm-hmm.
And so the kings, the others were more like feudalism, right, where you're out in the You got the kings, the nobles, right? The dominant groups who are out there, but most of the work is done by the peasants and the slaves and, you know, the common people. We don't know very much about common people of any of the ancient worlds. You know, they're just not there in the history. So we can guess. You know. Yeah, Gunther.
Yeah, I was just thinking, do you know how the inheritance worked at that time?
In which place?
Well, in Greece. Talking about in Greece.
Okay, in Athens, for instance.
In Athens, yeah. Was it the oldest boy, or what? How did it work?
Okay. So in Athens, the child of the oikos, right, the family, the house. Each unit was the family. The oikos was a family unit, and so the inheritance, the children in that family unit would only been. It was monogamous, supposedly. I mean, would have been the son of the head of the household and his wife. And if you had more children, okay, especially if you had girl children, unless they could be married off to some other oikos, if there are too many of them, you expose them. And a second child, boy child, you know, the heir and a spare might be fine, but usually the inheritance went to the father's eldest son. But unless he was wealthy, in which case he might be able to find a way to, and a lot of the old younger sons go off in the army. That's how they manage. In Sparta, it was different. In Sparta, every son of any Spartan citizen, right, not a slave, Helen, whatever, but every son of every Spartan citizen was more socialistic. They're automatically in the army. Everybody goes in the army, you know, and then you got to make your way and catch yourself a girl, you know, and continue the line. And anybody who's in the army can do that. So they just throw them all together. That was pretty funny, you know, when I first learned about that. Wow, that's unusual. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Cindy has a question.
Yeah, Cindy.
Gail, just out of curiosity, what do you think about these novels like Circe and the Penelopiad by Margaret Atwood? As far as it's like the old myths of Avalon, you know, retelling the stories from a woman's point of view.
Right.
Do you like them? What do you think?
I love them, of course. You know, I love the myths of Avalon, you know, and I do think that that's one of the, the great things that people can do when they go back and they look at history, because they, as we know, historical novels are infamous for, you know, changing the story, etc. But sometimes you really don't have to. And where women are concerned, so much was unknown. And in the 70s, I didn't know any of this stuff. When I first started teaching, I'd never heard of it. You know, I had a, master's and then some from a good college, but none of this was taught. So, but in the process, of course, of unearthing it, a lot of people have gotten in there and, of course, gotten their hand in. And one of the best ways to try and kind of get your ideas out is a good historical novel. They're fun to read, and they're, you know, of course, I tend to try to compare them to what I do know, but there's still so much that I don't, that, yeah, they're a great pleasure. I like them. And a lot of times there's truth in them. I mean, it's the stuff, though, that is not, we don't have any evidence for, that you can really play around with in a novel.
But, I mean, I think both, you know, where Atwood uses the 12 slaves of that Ulysses killed when he came back, as the chorus,
right?
Know, of the,
yeah. They can live again, right? Yeah.
Oh, I just thought, you know, Ulysses is not as a hero. Ulysses was not a very nice man.
Well, that's revisionist history, and when you look at anything from a different point of view, and in this case, women is a hugely different point of view, then you unearth a very different story, right? A very different picture. Even if you just use the facts we know, or if you take the Iliad or the Odyssey, right? I mean, we know now that I didn't even know that, but it's amazing what I didn't know. But of course, I studied modern Germany and not ancient society. That was forced on me when I started to try and find about women. I ended up suddenly in an area that was obviously, I'm an amateur here. But as I would find these things out, I would get and you could tell you can get a whole new story out of this old story, right? And the Iliad, we know now that Homer, lived probably somewhere around 800 BC, and none of this is even written down until the 400 BC. And so who knows what the real truth is? Archaeology, you can get up, statues and goddess figurines. You can argue over that. Well, is these really goddesses, or maybe they're Playboy bunnies? How come everybody's grave had a female in it? I would argue for the goddess. You don't take your Playboy bunny to your grave, you take your goddess that's going to help you in the next world. But you can argue that, you can do a whole book on it. It's kind of fun, I think. And and then if something comes up, it's like with Schliemann, Troy was just made up, it was just a great legend, right? A great story. And then comes somebody like Schliemann, and he finds a city, under a tell in Turkey. And he said, this is more than a story, but there's still a lot of room for imagination.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, it's great.
Okay. Well, it looks like we wrapped it up for the day then.
Okay. Well, folks,
Gail.
I hope you'll be back for the Romans. They have lots of good stories too. Thank you. Loved having you.